Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We've allowed time for a Q&A and discussion after our speakers, but you can type questions into our Q&A box at any time. Please keep them on topic, and please understand that we probably won't have time to answer them all, unfortunately, but any that aren't answered, we'll be using them to inform our future events. So first up, I wanted to say that we advertised that Fiona Broadfoot would be speaking at today's event. We're now really sorry to say that something has come up, so she's not going to be able to join us after all. We really do apologise for that, but we have excellent speakers for you lined up. Our first one is Anna Fisher, the co-founder of Nordic Model Now. So over to you, Anna.
Hello, everyone. Like most of you, I am sure I absolutely share the widespread horror at the treatment of the girls in the so-called Grooming Gangs scandals. But I'm also concerned at the narrow focus of much of the public debate. In this talk, I'm going to address some key questions. First, is this the behaviour of the so-called Grooming Gangs completely alien, having been brought here by immigrants from Pakistan? Or was the sexual use and abuse of working class women and girls already deeply entrenched in British culture? Second, was the fear of being accused of racism the main reason that the authorities turned a blind eye? Or was it a lot more complicated, given that the authorities have been turning a blind eye to similar behaviour by white men for centuries? I'm hoping that this talk will throw some light on these questions. But first, we need to understand some of the history. Many of the communities of people of Pakistani descent in the north of England have their roots in the large wave of migration to the UK from Pakistan after the Second World War, peaking in the late 1960s. This was very shortly after Pakistan had emerged from centuries of British colonial rule. They mostly came from rural areas of the Punjab and Azad Kashmir, where they lived in tight-knit villages with an almost feudal economy and strict patriarchal social structures. While women were at the bottom of the pile, they were surrounded by women of multiple generations, which provided solace and support and sometimes a counterbalance to the collective power of the men. The men responded to calls to help rebuild the British economy after the Second World War and found work in textile mills in Lancashire and Yorkshire, engineering industries in the Midlands, and light industry further south. Typically, the men would come first and only send for their families once they were established, sometimes years later. When their wives arrived, they typically lived in poor accommodation in rundown areas. And unlike their husbands who learned English at work, the women couldn't speak English. And as they mostly stayed at home, they had little opportunity to learn it. And they often became very isolated. This was in painful contrast to their lives back home, where they lived in multi-generational extended families, contributed to work on the family farms, and often had freedom to move around their villages where everyone was kin. One of the impacts of all this would have been to strengthen the men's position relative to the women in these migrant communities. Meanwhile, the social changes of the swinging 60s were forging ahead in Britain, with women adopting skinny tops, mini skirts, and hot pants, and racism was rampant, all of which would have tended to make these migrant communities who valued female modesty turn inwards. The police widely tolerated prostitution in the rundown areas where these families typically lived, and along with racism, sexism prevailed. The Yorkshire police spent the entire 1970s failing to catch the prolific serial murderer of women known as the Yorkshire Ripper, mainly because they failed to listen to all the women who had near misses with him and gave accurate descriptions that the police then ignored. Sian is going to talk later about how as a teenager in the 1980s, she was pimped by a local white drug dealer in a Midlands community, From when she was 13 years old until when she left school at 16, more than 5,000 mostly white British men raped her and paid her pimp for the privilege. What she experienced was utterly horrific, and it was not significantly different from what the girls exploited by the so-called grooming gangs also suffered. She says that everyone knew what was going on, almost certainly including the local police, but no one tried to stop it or to help her. Colloquially, she was the slapper who deserved everything that came to her. What happened to her was, and still is, British culture, a culture where often everyone knows that women and girls are being exploited in prostitution, but no one does anything to change it. In the 1960s and 70s, it was considered a bit of a joke, the subject of saucy seaside postcards like these ones, and of pantomime innuendo. Now that the sex work is real work ideology has taken over, it's no longer a joke. It's now considered a serious job. But either way, the women and girls who are its casualties are on their own. According to popular culture, they only have themselves to blame, and they should have chosen a different kind of job. Given all this, why should we be surprised that Pakistani men would also frequent prostitution, given its official tolerance and the patriarchal attitudes in their own culture? And later, as deindustrialization accelerated from the 1980s onwards, and many of the men lost regular livelihoods, why would we be surprised that they turned to pimping girls and young women and handing them round to rape like trophies, when this is what they saw white British men doing with pretty much impunity, particularly given the context of Western-made porn eroticizing and normalizing this behaviour, and this meshed so well with the low status of women in their own culture. There will always be people who push at boundaries to see how far they can go. That is why we have a criminal code, to make it clear that some behaviour is beyond the pale and you go there at the risk of sanctions that can be severe. That's the theory anyway. The trouble is, when the law is not enforced, it doesn't work like that. The British state has long allowed the brutal sexual exploitation of mostly working class girls and women to thrive, and legislation against the perpetrators to go largely unenforced. So surely the British state has the biggest culpability here, because this did happen in full view of the state, the Pakistani gangs, but also the entire burgeoning sexual exploitation industry and the vicious exploitation of Sian's prostitution in the 1980s and of so many other women and girls. In the 1980s, to all of this was added multiculturalism. On the surface, it sounds like an excellent thing. Don't we all want tolerance, mutual respect, and the valuing of all our unique cultures? Except that's not how the policy works in practice. Rahila Gupta of Southall Black Sisters explains it like this, I quote, "At its worst, multiculturalism challenges neither the structural basis of racism nor inequality. It relies on self-appointed community leaders who have no interest in social justice or women's equality. Through the politics of multiculturalism, the state more or less enters into an informal contract with the more powerful leaders in the minority community. In practice, community leaders maintain power over family and the cultural and religious affairs of the community, with the effect of concealing power relations between men and women and legitimizing women's subordination," end quote. Now, consider how this was grafted onto a police culture that already considered male violence against women and girls to be not real police work, and possibly something that women and girls intrinsically deserve, and that dealt with challenges and wrongdoing by closing ranks and turning a blind eye. The community leaders in these communities were invariably male religious leaders. Along with multiculturalism came multi-agency projects, which would give centrality to the community leaders while excluding more radical voices. The end result was often the ever further marginalization of women and the complete overlooking of their needs, while the community leaders would become part of the local hierarchies, tipping the balance of power ever further towards the men in these migrant communities. So once the sexual exploitation of girls by men in these Pakistani communities started to become obvious, the reaction would have been similar to what would have happened if it came to light that the sons of powerful white men in the police or local Rotary Club were running a prostitution ring. Or indeed, if it were a powerful white man like Cyril Smith, who was the MP for Rochdale for 20 years. No one would want to upset the chief constable of a local imam that had been sitting next to in multi-agency meetings for years. And anyway, it was just working class girls who only had themselves to blame. So everyone would close ranks and not only ignore the problem, but also do everything in their power to cover it up. Anyone who didn't comply with this was obviously too emotionally involved and would be rigorously sidelined. Once they'd done that, no matter what further evidence came to light, they'd have to continue the cover-up because otherwise they'd expose their own complicity. This is how hierarchical social organizations work. In retrospect, years later, they might say that it was because they didn't want to be accused of racism, but I believe that this is an oversimplification. To explain it as not wanting to be accused of racism sounds so much better than saying they were just a cowardly pawn who didn't give a fig what men do to children. It also conveniently displaces the blame onto overzealous anti-racism campaigners and political correctness gone mad. When the situation becomes too big to ignore, what usually happens is that one or two concessions are made which are presented as solutions, but that often bring about little improvement or might even make things worse. One example of this was the removal of all references to child prostitution from the English criminal law in 2015 and its replacement with the term child sexual exploitation, or CSE. This was in response to a campaign that used the tagline, "No such thing as a child prostitute." The idea was that if we changed the terminology, people would stop writing the girls off as prostitutes and would stop saying it was a lifestyle choice. But of course, changing attitudes and culture is much harder than changing terminology. There have been many unintended consequences of this. It implies that adult prostitution is a lifestyle choice, which we vehemently dispute. It also obscures the fact that the perpetrators sold girls to other men to sexually use and abuse for money, power, or status. In other words, the motivation was not just their own warped sexual gratification, but also financial gain, the exact same motivation of pimps who exploit adult women's prostitution. Recognizing this does not mean that we have to call the girls prostitutes or to incorrectly suggest their involvement is a lifestyle choice. But not recognizing the financial motivations of the perpetrators means that we're ignoring an important aspect of what is involved. The girls are not just sexually abused, they're also treated as commodities that can be bought and sold for another person's benefit. This is human trafficking under international law, regardless whether they were transported from place to place. Treating the exploitation of children's prostitution as a fundamentally different phenomenon from adult prostitution means that no one needs to think how the two are connected. So instead of seeing a massive interconnected problem linked by men's demand to sexually use and abuse women and girls, and the money that can be made from that, we get something like this. Some small problems that are not connected in any way and that don't require challenging men's demand. This means that nothing fundamental has to change. The police can continue to partner with the big pimping websites and to not enforce the law on pimping and brothel keeping. The government can continue to include prostitution in GDP, and no one needs to think twice when the government invests in Killing Kittens, a company that runs sex parties, or what are more accurately described as pop-up brothels. Yes, all these things are true and happening here in the UK right now. Of course, when paying for sex acts with an adult is considered acceptable, it is going to lower the inhibition to paying for sex acts with a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old. And what the hell, that 14-year-old is already well developed, so why not her too? It also obscures what is happening in these so-called grooming gangs. It is no accident that in the Oxford case, which came to court before the legislation was changed, there was clear recognition that commercial gain was a key motivation. This was recognised by the judge in his sentencing remarks and was picked up at the time by the press, which reported that one girl was sold for £600 an hour. Since the terminology in the legislation was changed to CSE, there has been much less acknowledgement, if any, of this aspect of these cases. Even the otherwise excellent Telford inquiry seemed devoid of awareness of the connections between adult and child prostitution and men's demand for both. It is as if the change in terminology has made people feel that it is somehow improper to acknowledge the reality of the exploitation of children's prostitution and its connections with adult prostitution. Sadly, it seems there is no equivalent inhibition to blaming the girls. Another little-known aspect of the current epidemic of sexual abuse of children in the UK is our age of consent laws. Most people assume that the age of consent is 16, and any sexual activity with a child younger than that automatically counts as statutory rape, or the equivalent for other child sexual offences. In fact, in the UK, this only applies if the child is 12 or younger. You heard that right, 12, before most children reach puberty. If the child is 13 or over, the defendant can claim that he thought she was 16 or 18 in CSE offences, and it is up to the prosecution to prove that this is not true. This is a get-out-of-jail-free card for men, allowing them to say, "I thought she was 16, Your Honour, honest." It is often simply impossible to prove that wasn't the case. In addition, the CPS guidance on consent includes a long section on consent in CSE cases. Even though consent is not relevant to the law on CSE, this complicates the prosecution of child sexual offences and is likely one reason that successful prosecutions make up such a tiny proportion of the reported cases. It is beyond time that the law was changed to move the burden of proof in all child sexual offences from the prosecution to the defendant, or even better, to make them strict liability offences. Another issue is that the Modern Slavery Act 2015, the human trafficking legislation in England and Wales, does not conform to binding obligations under international law, particularly as it relates to sex trafficking, which disproportionately affects women and girls. More or less all of the girls exploited in the grooming gang scandals meet the international definition of sex trafficking victims, but not under the definition in the Modern Slavery Act. This and policy based on similar rationale means that latest figures show that in the UK, approximately 3 times as many labour trafficking victims, who are mainly male, are recognised as sex trafficking victims, who are almost exclusively female. If you include criminal exploitation with the labour exploitation, the disparity is even more shocking, as this slide shows. This is extremely unlikely to represent the real facts. Instead, it shows that the British authorities are simply not recognising the huge rates of sex trafficking that's taking place right under their noses. This is skewing the European and even the global statistics so that it seems that labour trafficking is a bigger problem than sex trafficking. It is extremely unlikely that there is 3 or 4 times more labour trafficking in the UK than sex trafficking, because sex trafficking is obscenely profitable and comes with very little risk. Recent research found pimps and traffickers in the UK can gain £20,000 per month per woman or girl, meaning it is many times more profitable than any other form of human trafficking. Okay, so to go back to my original questions, is the behaviour of the so-called Pakistani grooming gangs totally alien to the UK? I hope the answer is clear, that no, it's not totally alien. The exploitation of the prostitution of working class girls and young women is deeply rooted in the culture of this country, and it is growing, thanks in large part to OnlyFans, which is a British company. It may be true that because of the unique nature of some of the Pakistani heritage communities, that men from these communities involved in the grooming gangs operate differently than, for example, the white men who also sexually abuse women and girls and ruthlessly exploit their prostitution. White men tend to operate in looser networks, whereas the men from these very tight-knit Pakistani communities tend to operate more clanishly. But frankly, I'm not convinced that that makes a huge difference to the terrifying reality for the girls involved. I have found it disturbing to see the rage directed at the Pakistani gangs by people who don't seem bothered by similar behaviour by white men or by the whole sexual exploitation industry. We have to ask whether it has become a legitimate way for white people to rage against men, white women in particular, while giving a free pass to the white men in their own families, sons, husbands, fathers, brothers, and male lovers, some of whom at least are almost certainly heavy porn users and statistically likely to be sex buyers, inflicting similar abuse and torture on women and girls. Then there are those like Charlie Peters, who is shown here, and Adam Wren, who are exposing the horrors of these scandals. While many of them are doing excellent work, I worry about the laser focus on the Pakistani gangs and find the apparent inability to see the links with the mainstream sexual exploitation industry disturbing. How can we understand what is happening if we don't join the dots? How can we have a hope in hell of changing it if we don't see the bigger picture and how porn is driving the normalization of this kind of behavior? On the surface, this does seem to me to be a form of racism, where it is acceptable to rage against Pakistani men, but not white men. White men like Leonid Radvinsky, who is the owner of OnlyFans, which earned more than $6 billion US revenue in 2023. A British company that in less than 10 years has succeeded in blurring the boundaries between pornography and mainstream culture in ways that earlier pornographers could only dream of, and that profits from and normalizes the brutal sexual abuse of women and girls as a business model. A man who pays himself more than £1 million a day. Why are we not raging at him and the other white men in the neoliberal elite who are scooping up ever more wealth from the suffering of women and children? As to the other question we started with, was the fear of being accused of racism the main reason the authorities turned a blind eye to the grooming gangs? In my view, I think we've seen that it was indeed way more complicated. The key was not wanting to upset powerful men. In other words, it is more of the same old patriarchy, the worship of power, the worship of those with power, the worship of the male, and the granting to all men the right to sexually use and abuse women and girls of lower social classes. There are many other examples of how the practice of multiculturalism and the consequent pandering to self-appointed male leaders has been discriminatory against women. For example, a law was introduced in 2002 giving courts the power to refuse to grant a divorce if a religious marriage has not already been dissolved. This has been a disaster for women in Muslim and Orthodox Jewish communities, where only men have the power to grant religious divorces. And this is sanctioned by the British state. Another example is that during the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement negotiations, the British government succumbed to demands from male leaders of both Catholic and Protestant communities to not extend the Abortion Act 1967 to Northern Ireland as a condition of continuing the negotiations. In this way, the British government violated its obligations to the women of Northern Ireland at the behest of male leaders, political leaders on both sides. I want to make it clear that this critique of multiculturalism is not in any way a criticism of racial tolerance and respect for cultural diversity. What I am critiquing is the way it was implemented by the authorities and the power it gave to unrepresentative patriarchal leaders. Rahila Gupta explained that the problem lies not merely with the multicultural approach, but with the way in which the notion of community is constructed. The authorities would seek leaders who looked as much like themselves as possible. As the authorities in the 1980s and 90s were and mostly still are, operating under the values of a patriarchal, hierarchical culture, they'd gravitate to leaders who also reflected these values and ignore, for example, Bolshevik women. It seems to me that this then became the modus operandi. I'm sure you can think of other examples, but a particular relevant one is how most authorities only listen to lobbyists for the expansion and normalization of the sexual exploitation industry, and not to those who see it as violence against women and girls. In Leeds, this led to the introduction of the decriminalised Holbeck street prostitution scheme. And this is why the authorities persisted with it for years, even after Daria Pionko was brutally murdered by a punter there. And it was clear that the huge numbers of male curb crawlers were terrorising women and children in the local community. It was not uncommon for male sex buyers to attempt to pick up schoolgirls in uniform on their way to and from school. And yet the authorities persisted with this for years, insisting against all the evidence that it was safer for the women. So while we may think that we live in a modern democracy in which women have equal rights as men, the reality is actually far removed from this. Our modern legislation has been grafted onto an establishment and systems that evolved over centuries before women even got the vote. This is demonstrated in our consent laws that date back to the 1880s and the patriarchal nature and values of most of our public institutions, including the police and local councils. Added to which, we've had decades of lobbying by well-funded pressure groups for the normalization of prostitution and the expansion of the sex industry. This slide shows the logos of just some of them. We understand that it was their lobbying that resulted in our shockingly sexist Modern Slavery Act, and that led in 2019 to Boris Johnson shelving the excellent age verification legislation that had already been passed by Parliament and replacing it with the much less rigorous Online Safety Act, which 6 years later has still not been fully implemented. I do not believe that the grooming gang scandals can be fully understood without understanding the limitations in the law and the dynamics that I have touched on. While the culture in the police and local authorities and other powerful institutions remain dominated by rigid hierarchies that value loyalty to the hierarchy, to those at the top, and to men's sex right above all else, I fear we are likely to see many more such scandals unfold. We need to change this. We need to change the narrative and the culture. We need to end men's impunity to rape and torture women and children. We need to say no to men's impunity. We need to say no to men buying sex acts under any circumstances, whether that's online on OnlyFans and the webcamming rooms or in real life. That's what the Nordic model is about. It's about making men understand that they cannot continue in the same way. Men are not babies, and they need to begin to act like adults, just as women are always required to do. We must resist. But please don't despair. As Alice Walker so perceptively says, resistance is the secret of joy. Thank you.
Thank you so, so much, Anna, for that just powerful and forensic analysis, and for grounding the whole discourse in a collision of cultures, but also giving us the economic impact of sex trafficking. Thank you so much. Now, before our next speaker, Sian, I'm going to very briefly run through the Nordic model, which we campaigned for, and explain how it differs from full decriminalization, which is the main alternative. So the Nordic model is also known as the equality model, and it is the only approach to prostitution policy and legislation that recognizes prostitution as part of the structural oppression of women and other marginalized groups, as both a cause and a consequence of the persistent inequality between the sexes. It was introduced in Sweden in 1999 after extensive research revealed A, the extent of women's suffering in prostitution, and B, sex buyers' ignorance and lack of care of the consequences of their choices and actions. So the researchers developed the idea of one-sided criminalization, whereby only buyers, rather than those selling sex, would be held accountable. So the specifics are, first, the Nordic model decriminalizes selling sex because no one should be criminalized for enduring exploitation and abuse. Second, it invests in services that provide support and genuine routes out of prostitution. Most research shows that about 90% of those involved want to get out but can't see how to. So the services need to include, first, access to safe, affordable housing, 2, training, 3, healthcare, childcare, legal financial advice and aid, emotional psychological support, and drug rehabilitation. Third, the Nordic model makes buying sex a criminal offense, with a key aim of changing men's attitudes and behavior. So it aims to create a society where no man could even imagine he has the right to sexually exploit another human being. The penalty for a first offense is typically a fine rather than prison, which then also provides funding for all those services. Fourth, the Nordic model strengthens laws against trafficking, pimping, and brothel keeping. And 5, included with all the above, there needs to be a plethora of holistic measures, including public information campaigns, education in schools, training for the police, long-term investment in services and alternatives for women, and real, concrete, and concerted measures to address poverty and inequality. When the Nordic model is well implemented, it has been shown to reduce the size of the industry and create a hostile destination for international traffickers. In Sweden, it's brought about a change in the culture and men's behaviour. It has widespread public support, and particularly among women and young people. There has been a significant reduction in the size of the prostitution industry during a period where it's been rapidly increasing in most other European countries. It is not surprising, therefore, that the prostitution industry hates the Nordic model. They insist it is more dangerous to the women involved, which is simply not true, as I will show. Nothing can make prostitution safe, which is why the Nordic model aims to give women genuine routes out and to prevent, particularly girls, but all marginalized young people, from being drawn into it. What the prostitution industry wants is full decriminalization, which means that all aspects of the sex trade are legal. Pimps and brothel keepers are transformed into legitimate business people, and buying sex becomes like going to the pub. Under full decrim, prostitution is regarded as standard business, so there's no public funding for services to help women exit. And laws against sex trafficking are retained, but in practice, they're almost impossible to enforce. Full decrim is held up by sex industry lobbyists as the best approach to prostitution. New Zealand pioneered full decriminalisation in 2003, and it has now been in place for 20 years. It is claimed by lobbyists and even the New Zealand government that there has been a decrease in the number of people involved, that it's safer for women, that women can refuse clients for particular services, that brothels have regular health inspections, and that condom use is compulsory. Those are the claims. However, the data in the New Zealand government's own assessments does not support a single one of their claims. What the data actually shows is that after the law was passed, there was a rapid increase in the size of the industry. Violence and coercion remain rife. Women can seldom refuse clients or specific acts. Unprotected sex is common because men always or nearly always ask for it. And there have only been 11 brothel inspections in 12 years, even though more than 1,000 brothel licenses have been granted during that time. Another claim is that there is no sex trafficking in New Zealand. It's true that there have been no prosecutions for sex trafficking since decrim has been in force. However, there were 133 recorded cases that meet the international definition of sex trafficking in the 9 years to 2011, and without doubt many more since then, and that have been never recorded. When the prostitution industry becomes legal, it always leads to an increase in the numbers involved, not least because it sends out a message of official approval. Prostitution is a normal job, buying sex is no different from getting a haircut or going for a pint, which all means that more men visit brothels more frequently. When prostitution is legal, in combination with the increase in the numbers involved, the police have less oversight and most sex trafficking is not detected, meaning that in practice, sex trafficking is also decriminalised. Under the New Zealand legislation, exploiting the prostitution of children is considered a minor offence comparable to alcohol violations. So most sexual exploitation of children also goes unregistered. So this slide compares full decriminalisation with a Nordic model. The left-hand column shows what full decrim means. Selling sex, pimping, brothels, buying sex are all legal. And because it's considered a normal and legitimate job, no public money is available in services to help women exit. On the right-hand side, we've got the Nordic model, where selling sex is legal, but pimping, brothels, and buying sex are illegal. And there's specific public funding for high-quality holistic services to provide support and genuine routes out to all those involved. Germany and the Netherlands have legalized prostitution, which in theory is different from full decrim, but there are, in fact, many similarities. In both countries, there's a massive industry with huge numbers of women involved. Both New Zealand and Germany have multi-story mega brothels operating in plain sight. In Germany, about 1 million men buy sex every single day. Pimps and brothel owners are considered respectable business people, and buying sex is seen as no different from getting a haircut. This chart uses publicly available data to show the percentage of the population involved in prostitution in 6 countries. Germany and the Netherlands with legalization, New Zealand with so-called decriminalization, and Sweden, Norway, and France, which have implemented the Nordic model. So the official data shows that a much smaller proportion of the population is involved in prostitution under the Nordic model than under legalization or full decrim. This suggests that the Nordic model is effective in reducing the size of the industry, or at least in preventing its growth. Campaigners for full decriminalisation say the Nordic model is more dangerous for the women involved. If this were true, we'd expect to see higher rates of homicide of women involved in prostitution in countries which have implemented the Nordic model and lower rates in countries that have legalisation or decrim. But this chart shows the number of women involved in prostitution murdered by pimps and punters and is expressed as an average annual rate per 100,000 female citizens during the years in which the legislative framework has been in place. And it clearly shows that the homicide of women involved in prostitution is significantly higher in New Zealand, Germany, and the Netherlands than in Sweden, Norway, or France. So the claim that Nordic model is more dangerous for women involved in prostitution is false. However, We want to be clear that we are not claiming the Nordic model is safer for women because we do not believe that anything can make prostitution safe. Instead, it aims to reduce the amount of prostitution that takes place and the numbers of people involved. So, data suggests that when implemented well, the Nordic model is successful in this. And the fact is that prostitution is a dangerous occupation, far more dangerous than being a firefighter or a police officer. And to illustrate this, I'm going to read a quote from an article by Valerie Hudson, who is an American academic. Quote, "The homicide rate for prostitutes is 229 per 100,000, which is higher than the highest workplace homicide rates of any regular occupation, such as liquor store workers, 8 in 100,000, taxi drivers, 27 in 100,000, and US soldiers, counting combat-related deaths, 27 in 100,000 between 1980 and 2010. Yes, you read that right. Prostitutes are almost 10 times more likely to be killed than soldiers in combat. There is literally no category of work with a homicide rate as high as prostitution. This should tip us off that this is not work, but in fact a form of socially sanctioned violence." Unquote. Thank you. And now our final speaker, Sian, who is a survivor of childhood grooming and was used in prostitution from the ages of 13 to 16. So thank you so much, and over to you, Sian.
Hi everyone, I hope you can hear me okay. As Chloe has said, my name is Sian. I was brought up in the Midlands, specifically in Coventry. Although Birmingham has a very large sex industry, Coventry is less thought of as having so, but it does, sadly. I was sexually abused as a child, which, as far as I know, is quite a big factor in many women who are in prostitution. It certainly helped to groom me into the frame of mind that I should just get it over and done with, whatever was done for me. My parents divorced when I was 12, so things weren't great at home, but I wasn't living in a terrible home. I didn't have awfully abusive parents. It was just a general low-income, hard-working mother, normal schooling kind of background that a lot of children have in the UK. When I was 13, I met a guy who lived near my school who I knew wasn't a fantastic guy. I knew he was a drug dealer, small-time car thief. We got talking. For whatever reason, we ended up kind of going out, not really a boyfriend, just sort of a casual thing. He would wait for me after school. After a short while, he started bringing a friend along. And I was told, well, you should do this with the friend. I didn't want to. It was difficult to get home because of where I lived. I had to go past them. So, I kind of just get it over and done with, as I learnt from sexual abuse. And the next day he turned up with a whole bunch of guys and there was no way to get away. And when I told my pimp no, he punched me in the face. And that was that. That was pretty much then every school night for the next 3 years until I ran away. That was the only way for me to get away from it. So I so-called worked every day after school. Now, my pimp, as I mentioned, lived near my school. He was a white guy. For him, earning money through pimping me was an easy way to earn money. It was less dangerous than selling drugs. It was less dangerous than breaking into people's houses and stealing cars. It was a great little earner, which is how a lot of pimps regard it, frankly. Most of my punters, punter is what we use for sex buyers in the UK. Most of my punters were white. There were a few from Afro-Caribbean. I think it depends on where you work. The area where I worked and went to school was a very poor area. Working class, a lot of us were Irish. There was a lot of unemployment. And at that point in time, my pimp was also unemployed. And for him, this was the only way he thought he could earn money. I'd like to talk about grooming. because I think it's quite an important thing that maybe parents would be worried about too. The fact that it's actually frighteningly easy to groom a child, where there's a combination of fear and benefit for the child in a really twisted way. As I said, my pimp was very good at meeting me after school. He was very aware that he didn't want the authorities involved because it would get in the way of him earning money. And so he was very careful to make sure I always got home on time, to make sure I had no bruises on my face, and to make sure that no one really told my mother. And he was also very good at using emotional blackmail and fear. Oh, you wouldn't want your mum knowing that you had sex with me, would you? She'd be really angry about that. And this is how pimps and groomers are very clever. They will find a girl, they will give her cigarettes or alcohol, and maybe they'll take her to a friend's house, a house that she's not supposed to see, or take her to see a boyfriend that she's not supposed to see. And then they've got that leverage with the child. Oh, your mum wouldn't want you knowing that you were smoking. What if your brother found out you went to see this guy who lives down the street? And they're very good then at using that. And oh, if you do this for me, then I won't tell your mum. Oh no, it's okay. It's only once. If you just do it, oh, but you did it last time. You wouldn't want your dad finding out that you slept with a whole bunch of guys for money, would you? And they're very clever where that is concerned, and it can be very difficult to get out of. They don't always start directly with violence. And even if they don't start directly with violence, even if there's no violence involved at all, it doesn't mean that that child wants to do this. It means that that child has no way out. And it's terrifying. It's very frightening as a child. Everybody in my school knew what was happening. Everybody in the estate where my school was knew what was happening. And as far as they were concerned, as Anna mentioned, I was just the slag. It was just one of those, you know, she asks for it. Poverty was a real driver. I never got any money. My pimp took all my money. They paid him before they paid me. I never got anything from it. But as I said, it's a fantastic earner. Poverty is absolutely behind prostitution. It's money is a real driver of this. And this is why I don't think you can separate child prostitution from adult prostitution, because the drivers are there. It's the same thing. I had nowhere to go. I had no one to speak to about it, partly because of my background, because I'm Catholic, my school was Catholic, and sex outside of marriage was very frowned upon. But also, who would I talk to when everybody thought I was a slag? And the official places were very much, we can't give you anything, any kind, we can't give you the pill, we can't give you condoms because you're under 16. They basically wash their hands of it. If we went over to full decriminalisation and sex work is work, judging from what I've read from people online, I would be regarded as a youth sex worker, and it would be my own agency, my own choice, and I should be supported in that. And because I'm terrified of my pimp, where else do I have to go? Who else can I talk to? And this is why the Nordic model is so helpful, because it provides help, it provides a way out, it provides people to talk to, it provides a way to get out of this hell, which was all I wanted as a child. I just wanted to get away. The reason I didn't run away was because I knew I'd have to work as a prostitute again on the street, and I didn't want to do that. I just wanted a place of my own and a regular job like a normal person. I would like to say very clearly that although race seem to be obviously the basis for some of these grooming gangs, grooming is not a Pakistani Muslim problem at all. It's not Pakistani Muslim men who are running all the brothels. It is not Pakistani Muslim men who are all pimps. This is a male problem. Specifically, men all over the UK are very happy to exploit women and girls in prostitution, because if they weren't, prostitution wouldn't exist. Sexism is absolutely behind this. Access to sex is seen as a right. Pornography is an enormous driver of it. In fact, one of the main things that happened to me when I was a prostitute as a child was men wanting to act out pornography. It was the biggest thing I wanted to do. It was a huge driver. Girls in prostitution and women in prostitution are seen as someone that men have the right to do anything they want to. They paid their money, they can do what they want. Now, my own experience of it was always in a group. My pimp would organise everything while I was in school, and then he would wait for me after school and take me to a group of men. And it would be me and a group of quite often grown men. The vast majority of them were white, all ages, mostly poorer backgrounds, but not all of them. Vast majority of them had girlfriends, children, wives, homes. They would never admit to it to their wives and partners what they'd done, but they were very happy to do it. And in a group situation, when one person does something violent, 9 times out of 10, the guys will laugh. And if they don't excuse it, they all carry on and do it. And it gets worse, and it can snowball horrifyingly fast until can be a very life-threatening situation. It's terrifying. It's terrifying for an adult woman, and it's even more terrifying for a child. And what those girls went through, in any girl who's been groomed in prostitution, it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. But I have to say, the problem lies with men who pay. You cannot have a pimped child. You cannot have a child groomed into prostitution if you don't have someone there to buy, because it's about money and control, but it's about money. People want to earn a profit. And it's no different, child grooming, to adult prostitution, when women are pushed into it for whatever poverty reasons, or men pushing them into it. Men need to be held to account. Men need to know that it is wrong to pay for sex. It's wrong. And it doesn't matter whether they thought I was over 16 or not. As Anna said, very often men will claim, oh, she told me she was over 18, she looked 16, how was I supposed to know? Every single punter knew I was under 16 because I was in my school uniform, and my school had a very specific uniform for under 16s, and it was by far the biggest school in the area, so everybody knew the uniform. The only comments I ever had that were negative were, oh, have you got a younger sister? They were all, oh, God, it's so cool that you're into it so young. Oh, it's really hot. And yet if anybody had asked them, police or anything like that, it would have been, oh, she told me she was over 16. How was I supposed to know? And they're the same men that would be out with pitchforks if they thought a paedophile was living in their street. But when it comes to paying for sex with a little slapper, which is how they regard girls in prostitution who have been groomed there, they have no issue with that. This is what needs to be called into account. The male attitude that they can, if they pay, they can do as they like. And men think they can get away with anything when it comes to that. And it's wrong. It has to stop. And again, this is where the Nordic model is so crucial, because it holds men to account. It tells them that it's wrong to pay for sex. It's wrong to groom children. It's wrong to groom adults. You cannot pay money and expect someone to completely suspend their human rights and to do whatever they like. It's wrong. And my heart goes out to the girls that were involved in this, because it's horrifying. It takes a lifetime to learn to live with, because you don't get over it. You learn to live with it. And that's not an easy thing. It has physical, long lasting physical problems afterwards. Gynecological problems. It could be broken bones that don't heal, breathing problems, definitely mental health problems. It leaves a horrifying devastation in its wake. To pin this on just say it's Pakistani Muslim men that are responsible, no, it's not. It's not at all. People who buy sex and those who want to profit from women and girls' bodies are the problem, and they need to be held into account, and it needs to stop. And frankly, I think the Nordic model is the only way that we can do this. I think that's about it from me. If anyone would like to ask any questions, you're more than welcome. I hope this has been helpful and I didn't jabber too much. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. It's been wonderful to be able to talk to you all. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Sian, for so powerfully speaking about your experience and also what this means for today's young girls and women. So now we'd like to open it up for a Q&A. We've already got some questions in the box, but please do continue to put anything you would like to ask into our box. I'll start with the first one, and I think maybe this could be for both speakers. Do you know of any groups or individuals within the Muslim communities where these gangs operate who are working on the ground to stop them and other men and boys from getting involved, or working to support their female victims? If there are any, how exactly are they doing it?
I'm really sorry that I can't help you with this, with anything specific. I would recommend that in whatever area you're in, that you contact any good faith organisations and ask them for advice on local organisations that, or people who are working on this within the Muslim communities. I do know that the Muslim Women's Network a few years ago did an excellent study showing that it's not just white girls who are sexually exploited by Pakistani men, that there are also a lot of Pakistani girls and Sikh girls and Hindu girls and other girls of other Asian and ethnic backgrounds. We have a link to that somewhere on our website.
As far as I know, Rape Crisis were very helpful to me. I know they have a very large waiting list at the moment, but they are always very good at signposting onto other places. In Yorkshire, specifically South Yorkshire, Snowdrop are very good at survivors of trafficking. They're there for all survivors of trafficking, so men, women, children, but they're very good at supporting women who have been trafficked, specifically those who may not have been brought in from other countries, so have been trafficked internally in Britain. They're excellent. They're very, very good at dealing with that. So if you look those up, I can recommend those.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. We've got some other questions in from the chat. How do we stop this and bring the Nordic model when it is mostly still men and privileged women in power, in the police and in parliament, etc.?
Shall I go first? Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Well, it's difficult. I mean, I do think it's very difficult. We know that we currently have 2 junior ministers in the Home Office, which has responsibility for prostitution policy, who support the Nordic model, Jess Phillips and Dame Diana Johnson. However, they've taken over, they've taken over an organisation that's had 14 years under a different government, which was has been very influenced by the full decriminalisation lobby. So I think even though they're there, that they're in a really difficult situation to actually bring about change. And I think what we all need to do is to kind of raise awareness, to make sure that people understand that there is an alternative to full decriminalisation and that we need it, and that that all these issues are not separate. I think that's what I find so disturbing about much of the public narrative about the grooming gangs, is that it's like seen as an isolated thing and not part of like this huge problem of violence against women and girls. So, I mean, I think all we could do is to carry on what we're doing. raising awareness, write to your MP. If you're part of a political group or a trade union, we'd recommend that you raise the issue there. We're always provided, Nordic Model Now is always happy to provide speakers for, like, if you want to organize an event for your trade union branch or your political party constituency group or a group in the hospital or whatever, do please get in touch. But yes, it's tough and we need to keep at it.
I think I just echo what Anna said. If we can start at grassroots with it as well, just basically talking about it with people that are around you, family, friends, neighbours. I know it's not an easy subject to bring up. Sometimes it comes up. Don't just excuse the sex industry as, oh, it's just something that happens, or it's a great way to earn money or whatever, because it's not. It's really not. We have to want better for our young people and children. I don't want young people in the future feeling that this is the only way they can earn, especially not young women, especially not poor young women. They deserve better than this. They deserve proper jobs. They deserve decent housing. And they have every right to demand and work for that. And yes, absolutely, talking to your local MP is a great idea, and union leaders, absolutely.
Yeah, completely agree. And just to add from my end on a sort of more on a better note, maybe, change is happening all the time. Since Sweden implemented the Nordic model first in 1999, we've seen many other countries following suit. So there absolutely is a path and a route to changing this and implementing the Nordic model. We've got another question. Is help with finding secure employment or further education and training for survivors also part of the Nordic model?
Yes, absolutely, definitely. The Nordic model, I mean, the aim, and I mean, it's been implemented with different levels of effectiveness in different countries, but that is definitely the aim, that there should be like a one-stop shop for help for women and anyone involved in prostitution. So whatever they need, and obviously finding alternative employment, it must be a really important part of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's see. Yes, so we've got another interesting question. What are Nordic Model Now doing to support Ash Regan, who is a Scottish MSP, unbuyable campaign to change the law in Scotland? And do you have statistics on sex trafficking between Scotland and the rest of the UK?
Definitely, we support Ash Regan with her campaign, and we are actually asking her if she'd like to do a webinar with us probably in June. So hopefully that will be coming up. We'll give her a platform to talk about it more. Most of us in Nordic Model Now is an unfunded grassroots group, and most of us don't live in Scotland, and there are other groups campaigning in Scotland. So our focus is probably more on England and Wales than Scotland, but we definitely do support them. And regarding trafficking statistics, so under the international definition of human trafficking, being transported from place to place is not actually a requirement to come under that definition. The definition is, the key part of it is the exploitation of someone's prostitution. So someone profiting, taking advantage of someone's vulnerability and profiting from their prostitution. And as I mentioned in my talk, most of what happens in England and Wales in particular, and to a possibly lesser extent in Scotland, most sex trafficking in the UK is not recognised. I think by possibly a factor of 20 or more.
Thank you, Anna. Next question. How would the speakers, so for the both, relate internet manosphere attitudes and social permissiveness surrounding men buying sex, and thinking in particular of characters like the infamous Andrew Tate and probably many others that glorify the image and role of a pimp as a lifestyle to be emulated and often target boys and younger men?
Sian, do you want to start with that?
I think just trying to talk to boys and younger men about it, because they seem to have a very idealistic view of how the sex industry is, that it'll be everything they think of when they meet, you know, a gorgeous girl and they can do whatever they like with her, and that's not the reality of it any more than it's the reality of earning a ton of money and living a wonderful lifestyle if you work on the other side. So I think we need to have very honest conversations with our young men about prostitution and how terrifying it can be, and how these images that you see on screen, they're real people. You know, you wouldn't treat your school friends like that. You wouldn't treat your little sister like that. You wouldn't treat your mother like this. And I have sons, and I would like to hope that my sons wouldn't want anybody to treat me like that. So why would a young man act that way? And it's a shame that you have to bring it so personal to them to understand it, but quite often you do, because when there's a screen in the way, it's very easy to other that person on the other side of the screen. And so I really think we need to have very honest conversations with our young people about this.
Yes, I'd just like to echo that and say, and I think that you know, Andrew Tate is obviously a problem, but I think that the messages are much greater than that. And you know, many of them and one of the things that really worries is like things like OnlyFans, which is kind of bringing the attitudes of the sex industry, of prostitution, into the mainstream. So making it seem like the value of women and girls is just for their use as sex objects, and that is a completely normal thing. So I think, you know, there is so much work that needs to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that a lot of people have become interested in the topic, especially since the new drama Adolescence was shown. And you know, I think it's so important that this issue gets the attention it deserves. But at the same time, I absolutely agree that I think honest conversations are needed with boys that recognize their perspective as well, and actually offer a positive route and a mindset for them to build. So thank you both. Another question. So I used to be part of a sexual abuse service for women under the umbrella of the NHS Mental Health Service. Sadly, the service tried to wreck this therapy service run by women of various professional backgrounds, and eventually it came to an end close 2020. How do we get services to provide if both men and women managers see everything in the short term, providing only behavioral therapies, and if women aren't getting better, it's their own fault? So maybe both speakers could offer their thoughts on that.
Yes, I mean, it's very depressing that, yeah, we know, we're aware that this has happened all over the place, and also the whole kind of sex work is work ideology really kind of feeds into that it's a choice, and therefore if it doesn't work out, it's it's the woman's fault for making that choice. And yes, I mean, I personally kind of really like the work of Jessica Taylor in challenging this whole kind of mental health paradigm and the way it is used to do exactly this, to blame people for the inevitable response to the difficulties that they've had in their life, the trauma they've experienced. So I would recommend looking her up and seeing, following the work that she is doing, perhaps, suggesting that she comes to speak to you in the part of the NHS you work in.
I think I'd absolutely agree with that. I've had experience of both NHS mental health support and run through various charities, and I found the NHS support to be less than ideal. It was always timed, and it was always, I don't know how to describe it. I had one psychologist who laughed when I told her about prostitution as if she didn't believe me, and these kinds of things. It was very difficult. Whereas I found with the charity-based support, it was with women who I felt were there to really support me, no matter what. And while I know a lot of charities are really struggling because the entire country is struggling, and there's not a lot of money around, it was that really got me through. And I was in and out for 20 odd years of counselling just to get the stability that I am now. And that's what we're looking at. That kind of commitment needs to be made. And I think if you look at how expensive it is, purely financially, if the government want to base things, on a financial level, it must cost so much money for women to be in and out of hospital, maybe on benefits when they could be working, maybe, illnesses that might be preventable if they were given support, whether it's with self-harm, whether it's with addictions, if education, so they can do a better job, so they don't have to do a job that's more harmful to them. And these are all things that, again, it comes back to grassroots. I think we have to start pushing for this locally. Hey, that's how Rape Crisis started back in the day, isn't it? Women organising it, and maybe that's what we have to do, because it's difficult. It is difficult. I'm not saying there's an easy answer. It takes a long time and a lot of support. But women reaching out to other women, and for male survivors as well, men reaching out to other men would be wonderful. And it's that kind of support, not just saying, well, if you don't get over it within 20 weeks, I'm sorry, we can't help you anymore. That's not how this works. No, there needs to be a decent long-term commitment. And I think over time, again, if you think long-term, it will be helpful. If you're only thinking, oh, we want quick results, you're never going to get the answer. So yes, I think the NHS needs a little more focus there, long-term, more commitment to it, absolutely.
Yes, and I think, as Anna said, education and training for the NHS staff is absolutely also part of the solution. I've got here a question for Anna, which I thought was very interesting. What are your thoughts on a national statutory inquiry into the grooming gangs?
I'm old enough to remember the Chilcot inquiry into the Iraq War, and it produced a lot of really damning evidence. But as far as I'm aware, no one was held to account, even though the wrongdoing involved waging an illegal war that led to massive loss of life and subsequent problems in the Middle East and beyond, which have contributed to the large numbers of migrants coming here to escape them to this day. And there have been many other statutory inquiries into public scandals, including the Independent Child Abuse Inquiry, the Grenfell Tower Inquiry, the Contaminated Blood Inquiry, and so on. Often they uncover all sorts of dodgy, corrupt, and even illegal behaviour, but they're not good at holding people to account. They typically cost multiple millions and often take years, during which nothing is done, on the issue because everyone is waiting for the inquiry report. And by the time the report comes out, years have gone by, the government might have changed and the issue has dropped off the agenda. And then there's often very little pressure then to implement the inquiry recommendations. And I'd even go so far as to say that the authorities often instigate an inquiry when they don't want to address the issue in question. The inquiry pushes it into the long grass, and when it comes back, hopefully other people will deal with the mess. Another problem is that public inquiries often have very limited terms of reference. A good example is the Thirlwell inquiry into the events at the Countess of Chester Hospital, which took the guilt of Lucy Letby as one of its starting points, meaning that it hasn't been able to consider the extensive evidence that has since come to light that her conviction might be a miscarriage of justice that possibly came about through efforts to hide other serious shortcomings at the hospital. We've already had comprehensive inquiries into some local grooming gang scandals, including Rotherham and Telford. I absolutely understand the need to hold individuals to account. However, what we're up against is a structural system that systematically and systemically prioritizes men and their needs and so-called rights at women and girls' expense. And I'm not convinced that an inquiry would do anything to shed light on this or bring about the real structural change that we need, just as the 7-year-long National Child Abuse Inquiry has so far not brought about significant change. So for all these reasons, I don't think that a national statutory inquiry is the way to go. In my opinion, a much better option would be to stand up to the sexual exploitation industries that are normalizing and profiting from the behaviour seen in the grooming gang scandals and in the wider sex industry. And so, as I said earlier, we need to end men's impunity to pay to sexually use and abuse women and girls, because that's where this all starts, men's so-called sex right. And so, yeah. So that's my feeling about it. We know what we need. We need the Nordic model. We need it to be implemented enthusiastically nationwide, and we need, to stand up to the sexual exploitation. So no more advertising for prostitution and other so-called sexual services. We need robust age verification on porn, which I don't think the Online Safety Act is going to give us, and the banning of porn that eroticizes and incites violence against women and girls and ethnic and racial groups. We need the police to pull their finger out and enforce the law, which they're not currently doing, the law against brothels and pimping and buying sex where it is implemented, like curb calling and buying sex from someone who's been coerced. And we need, and we need better services for women. Like, we need the NHS to be kind of better at not blaming people for the trauma that they've experienced. And we need to provide help for men to get them out from under their brutal porn addictions. And we need CEDAW to be implemented in national law. So that's what I would say.
Absolutely. It's good to have your opinion on this, Anna. Got another question here. Why have we referred to men of Pakistani origin and Muslim grooming gangs, but we do not refer to white males as white or Christian?
I mean, I think that's what this whole webinar is trying to address, that we see that this problem is far bigger, and that, the very narrow focus on Muslim or Pakistani men is unhelpful, and in some ways misleading. So yes, and I do think that there is some kind of racism within that. I personally have found it disturbing to see women who I know rage online, you know, on social media about Pakistani Muslim gangs, when I never see them supporting, for example, the work of Nordic Model Now and you know, the issues around prostitution and the white men who do this same behaviour. Because I mean, let's face it, most, you know, the recent government report on porn, much of that of what it described is really the same behaviour that we're seeing the grooming gangs, so-called grooming gangs, acting out on women and girls. So this is being promoted, you know, this is such a big issue, and it's, yeah, and I find it offensive, the very narrow focus and the disregard for the connections.
Absolutely. We're unfortunately running out of time, so I'll just run through some quick fire questions. Is Nordic Model Now working with male-serving organisations as allies to address male demand for commercial sex? Which agencies are working with men to change this?
Well, I mean, Nordic Model Now is happy to work with anyone who kind of sees things in a similar way to us. So we work with, for example, Michael Conroy, who does a lot of brilliant work training teachers and youth workers and all sorts of people about how to have constructive conversations with boys. So yes, definitely it's something that needs to happen. But while there's so much kind of obfuscation that the problem is that men's demand, you know, the authorities are unlikely to invest in such services. But definitely that is something we call for.
Absolutely. And one question for Sian: what types of behaviours or patterns should I look for in my son or daughter? I presume this is in response to your discussion of grooming with today's young kids.
It can be difficult. You need to really know your child, I guess. I personally went about hiding it as much as I could because I was frightened. But there were absolutely signs. I was very withdrawn in school. My schoolwork nosedived completely. I was very quiet. When I came home, I had a very specific routine of washing and doing certain things. And if you're on the ball, you would see that happening and wonder why does my daughter have to come home and wash everything? That's not normal. On the flip side, it can be acting out. There were other girls in my school who were involved in prostitution, not with the same pimp. They would stay out very late and drink alcohol. Typically not something that they were doing in the years previously. That could be an issue. Any marks or things like that on the body, I'm not saying jump on it, but it can be, you know, embarrassment around certain subjects or really not wanting to deal with or face anything about prostitution or the sex industry could be a bit of a tell. I would have run a mile if anything about it had come up because it was embarrassing to me and frightening. My mum actually met and spoke to my pimp at one point. He made a point to go up to her. He only asked the time, but he wanted me to see that he could go and contact my mother at any point in time, and my mother would throw me out if she knew what I was doing, for sure. And it was obvious that I was terrified. And she was like, "Do you know him?" And I had to lie and say that I didn't. Those kind of things, if you sense that your child is frightened or off, definitely at specific times of the day or in specific positions, it's a good idea to ask. Your child might not be able to come out with it. It might just be, oh, I'm uncomfortable around this person, but at least there's a door there for you to begin talking about it. So that's kind of the best I can offer, is to know your child, and always, you know, is this okay? How are you doing? You know, or I noticed you're not feeling well today. Why is your stomach hurting when you come home from school? This kind of thing. It doesn't have to be direct and accusatory, but be open to discussion and be aware that your child may talk around it a lot, because directly confronting it may be too frightening for them.
Thank you. Thank you so much for ending on a very practical and helpful note. We are coming to the end of our webinar, so I just want to say thank you so much to our wonderful speakers, and also to all of you for joining us today and for sticking around until now. Please do stay in touch. We've got a website with a plethora of really useful resources to help you understand and do your own advocacy. Follow us on social media, and please do also sign up to our newsletter. We've got lots of information on all these resources. And I'm also very excited to say that on the 21st of May, that's a Wednesday, we'll be having a fundraising party in central London. Tickets are already out on sale, so please go ahead to our website and grab one for yourself. It's nordicmodelnow.org/about/events. Please join us from 5 p.m. for drinks and dancing from 7 p.m. We look forward to seeing you there. It will be really good. And yes, once again, thank you everyone so much, and we'll see you next time.